Can you see me? Yeah. And well, I did before. It's just sometimes the collar's under the sweater and sometimes the collar's over the sweater. um, and can you hear me? Okay, good, 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 good. I was a little worried that the sound might not be quite up to snuff. And I'm hearing the sound over the phone now, so you may want to turn it off unless there's something you want to say. Yeah. Yeah. Do a little introductory thing in the chat so I know when to begin. Yeah. Thank you. Okay, it's 9 o'clock according to my clock. I only see one person on at the moment. Um, the but this is being recorded, so I will begin anyways. Um, the last time someone asked a question uh, um, about elections, and because I had said something about under Robert's Rules of Order how it's always a majority vote. Um, the first thing I would suggest doing is, first of all, look at your governing documents. Look at if state law applies. Look at state law. But unless your governing documents or your state law makes specific provisions for specific kinds of voting, you can either on a case-by-case basis or on a permanent basis specify any form of voting pretty much that you want. The only thing that Robert's Rules of Order is hostile to is proxy voting, which is where you give your vote to somebody else to cast for you, and cumulative voting, where you have 3 votes as an example, and you can cast all 3 of them for one candidate, and as opposed to 1 vote for each of 3 candidates, assuming there were 3 positions to be elected. But even those 2 can be done if you amend your governing document or you pass a standing rule. If the motion is made to affect the form of voting before you actually start on the election, then it's debatable, amendable, etc. If, however, you've already started the election, nominations have been made, or ballots have been passed out, and you're trying to determine the method of voting, whether it's plurality, majority, or some form of preference voting, then the motion can be made, but it's not debatable if there's an election pending. That's basically it. Now, there's all kinds of voting that you can do, and one of my handout sheets has those different methods of voting. I do want to talk a little bit, not about the ones that were explained, but about the ones where I simply gave a list. Serpentine voting is where you have people either raise their hand or stand up, and as someone physically counts them, they either sit down or they put their hand down. So 1, 2, 3, 4, and so on. And then you do that for the yeses, and you do that for the nos. And it's called serpentine voting because you go down one row and up another and back and forth and so on and so forth. Preference voting is any form of voting where you're asked to rank your choices, first, second, third, fourth. And many alternative forms of voting use preference voting, but how you count them varies depending on what method you're using. Approval voting is interesting because in approval voting, you're allowed to vote for as many choices or candidates as you want, regardless of the number to be elected. And whoever gets the most votes is supposed, or whatever choice gets the most votes, is assumed to be the most preferred choice of the candidates. It's a form of voting. The only place I know of for sure where it's used is it's an alternative form of voting in California for school boards, of all things. Weighted voting is where you cast votes, but the votes have different weights. So say you're voting for 16 candidates, and this is similar to preference voting in some ways, but you're voting for 3 candidates. You rank them 1, 2, and 3. The first vote has more weight than the second vote and the third vote, and they're added up in some way to reflect that. And I won't go into all the details, but that's what weighted votes. So different votes you cast have different weights depending on the order that you cast them. And finally, there is unanimous consent, which is the decision model used in many consensus decision-making processes, where everybody has to agree. That if anybody disagrees, then you have to continue the discussion or it doesn't pass. So I just wanted to explain those real quick because they're just kind of listed in the handout and they're not explained like the stuff above. Now, I also want to talk a little bit about how rules are modified when you're dealing with small groups, let's say a dozen or under, so a committee, because obviously you don't need to put the full weight of the formal process on a small group, especially if it's a small group with a well-defined purpose or a small group where there's not a lot of disagreement or hostility between the members. So in a small group, first of all, people aren't required to get the attention of the chair before they speak. There still should be some enforcement of not speaking over each other or speaking in order, not speaking a second time, you're talking about the first time, but you can just jump in and speak. You don't need a second in small groups most of the time. Again, remember this is under 12 people. And in really small boards, like a 3-member board, a second is kind of redundant. In a 3-member board, you only need 2 to pass anything, so a second is a bit redundant. There's no limit on the number of times you can speak, unlike under normal Robert's Rules of Order procedures, where you can only speak twice to any one debatable question. And also many times in committees, small groups, informal discussion is allowed without there being a motion on the floor. So you've got to say, we've got to come up with a proposal on this matter. And you bat the idea around until finally something comes out of the discussion in the form of a motion that is made by your committee to propose to your larger body, just as an example. The chair is not required to be neutral in the terms of their debate. They can involve themselves in the debate in a small board in ways that they can't in a larger group. And sometimes, and if the proposal that is being discussed has come up in the discussion is extremely clear to everybody, you can vote on it without necessarily someone having to make a formal motion, so long as everybody is very clear about what it is that they're voting on at that point. That's important in any decision. But in a small group, sometimes you have a discussion, you have an informal discussion, it's very clear what the proposal you're going to come up with is. The chair may state that, and then you vote on it. So that's basically the major differences when you're dealing with a small board or committee. Again, a dozen members or under is the rule of thumb. Now I'm going to get to what I promised I would get to last time, and that is tactics of debate. Now we're going to start with the tactics that you might use if you want to get something passed. Now, I can't overemphasize that if it's a major thing, at least anyways, how much you have to pre-plan this. You should know well ahead of the meeting what it is you're going to propose. You should have it written down. You should have as many of your people who you know you can trust aware of what's going to happen, and maybe even have given them certain roles in the debate. Okay, so you make your motion. As the maker, whoever proposes the motion should be given the right to speak first. If they do so and they exercise that right, you should try to make as short and concise a statement in support of the motion as possible. If you've got a number of people lined up to speak, you could in theory have each person make one point, a different point each time. If you've got that many points in support of the motion, so that you sort of build up a little bit of momentum. When I was in the military, when I was taught how to train people, I was taught that the format is something like this. You tell people what you're going to say to them. You then tell them, and then you close by telling them what you just told them. And that's not a bad thing to do with a short speech, at least anyways. You sort of pound the point home in different ways. I mean, but you try over and over and over again. You should know what the rules are in your assembly. We've gone over that a little bit, but obviously you should know what your rights and privileges are if you're going to do this. If you have any control over when the motion is made, try to make it at a time when it's most favorable for you. Maybe that's early in the meeting, maybe that's later in the meeting. That depends on the organization, but try to get your thing on the agenda at a time when it's most favorable for you to get your motion passed. Try to anticipate your opponent's arguments. Or if you can't do that, again, have people lined up, because if the chair is doing their job, they're going to alternate between people in favor and people opposed. So you as the maker of the motion, you make your proposal, you debate in favor of it, somebody gets up and opposed it, you have one of your allies ready to get up and counteract that argument if they can. If you can anticipate what the arguments are, that's a good thing. But if you can't, be prepared. Because remember, that you can't speak, if they're following the rules, you can't speak again until everyone who wants to has spoken. So you need other people ready to speak in favor of your motion, either to make further points or to counteract opposing arguments. There's something called a parliamentary inquiry. If you want people to be sure of what the rules are, you get up and say, Mr. Chairman, what is the vote that we need to pass this? Is it a 2/3 or a majority? So to let the whole assembly know what the rules are that they're operating under, if they're unclear. The other thing you should also do, by the way, is make absolutely sure that the chair restates the motion before the vote, and they restate it accurately, because the assembly needs to be aware of what it is they're voting on. If anybody makes any motions that are hostile, like a motion to postpone indefinitely, a motion, an amendment that will weaken your motion in a way you don't want it weakened, of course, speak against it. Do everything you can to prevent that. If you need it done immediately, of course, speak against any attempt to delay it, any Senate committee. Now, maybe you don't want to do that, but if it's something you feel needs to be voted on and passed tonight, you obviously need to oppose any of those motions. If you feel you got momentum, that if the vote is taken right now, you will win, then have somebody ready to make a motion for the previous question, to move the question. That is a motion, non-debatable, to immediately close off debate, go directly to a vote, takes a 2/3 vote to pass, and then make sure they actually do the vote. Because lots of times what happens in organizations is they pass the previous question, and then for some reason they assume that means they voted on the motion, which they haven't. What they've done is they voted that they want to vote on the motion. I know that sounds redundant, but that's what they've done. And then they proceed to a vote on the motion itself. So make sure that they don't make that mistake. Sometimes a motion to recess can be important. If you've got a lot of, if you know there are people who have some uncomfortable feeling about some part of the motion, and you know that if you could talk to them on the side, so to speak, and maybe come up with a compromise that could be proposed as an amendment. You could make a motion for a 5-minute recess or a 10-minute recess and have that side discussion so that you can have that side discussion without losing, without breaking your attention on what's happening in the motion itself, in the assembly itself. So the motion to recess can sometimes be used to your advantage if you feel, first of all, you can get it passed, and secondly, if you feel that all you need to do is have some sort of private conversation with this person who has clearly indicated that they're uncomfortable with the motion as it is, or if you could come up with some sort of simple, by discussing with them, you come up with some simple amendment that you're okay with that will get their support. Now, this is very, very important. This last piece is important. You've got your motion passed. You need to make sure to maintain pressure on whoever is in charge to actually implement the intention of the motion. I don't know how many times I've seen an organization pass some wonderful motion, and then the chair or the secretary or the treasurer or the executive board or whoever's responsible for implementing the motion simply doesn't do it. Doesn't even report back to the body that says, well, we didn't do it and we didn't do it because. They just don't do it. So at the next meeting, you might get up and say during the chair's report, Mr. Chairman, what action has been, just as a simple example, what action has been taken to implement the motion we passed last time? Have you appointed the committee yet? Have you wrote the letter yet? Have you made the purchase yet? Whatever the motion was, you need to make sure to monitor it, to make sure that it gets done. The other thing you need to do is when you get your copy of the minutes, make sure the minutes accurately reflect what was passed. Because the minutes are again, I said this last time, the minutes are the official record of what was done at the meeting. And if time goes by and people can't remember, they're going to refer to the minutes. And so you need to make sure that whatever's in the minutes in terms of the motion and the vote that passed it and so on and so forth accurately reflect what actually happens. Now, here's something you can do. If you know you're going to lose, have somebody on your side vote against the motion. And the reason for this is that person can then make a motion to reconsider. But they have to be on the prevailing side to do that. This is something you only want to do if you're absolutely sure you're going to lose, okay? Because what you don't want to do is lose by one vote because you had one of your own guys vote against the motion. When the motion to reconsider is made, then depending on the circumstances, you'll either vote on it at that meeting or the next meeting, but you can try to put it off to the next meeting. Matter of fact, there's a special kind of motion to reconsider called reconsider and enter on the minutes. And if you make that motion, not only do you get the motion to reconsider on the floor, but they have to put it off to the next meeting. So that gives you time to lobby the people who are against the motion. Now, that's assuming, of course, that you're not talking about something that you needed to do right now. There are things that come up that you can't wait until the next meeting. But if it is, and you want that time to lobby, reconsider and enter on the minutes is, and you might have to inform your chair or your parliamentarian what that is. Is a motion that the motion to reconsider has been made, but it's put off till the next meeting to vote on the motion to reconsider. Now, what about if you oppose a motion? What are the tactics when you oppose a motion? Well, I mean, the most obvious thing, of course, is you speak against the motion. I mean, of course, if it's a debatable motion. And of course, you vote against the motion. Of course. You try to expose the weaknesses. You try to, I don't know how, if you get some prior notice, you do some study, look at the motion, figure out why it is you're opposed to it, other than just sort of visceral, I don't like this. Which is not an invalid feeling at all, but if you're trying to make an argument to keep it from being passed, you've got to come up with something that will convince other people. You can move a motion to postpone indefinitely does two things, by the way. First of all, it renews any rights of debate because it's a motion it's a debatable motion. And despite what it says about postponing, it's actually a motion to kill the motion. So you move to postpone indefinitely. If you've already spoken twice and you're against the motion, move to postpone indefinitely. You've got 2 more times to speak. And if the motion passes, you've killed the motion. Amend it to make it either more agreeable to you, make a motion to amend so it's more agreeable to you, or sometimes you can sort of poison pill it. You can amend it in a way that you know will pass, but you also know will make it unacceptable to people who were previously before the motion. So motions to amend can do that. You can't reverse the meaning. You can't turn a yes into a no or a no into a yes, to put it simplistically, but you can sometimes amend it to pull people from one side to the other. Like before, use the previous question to your advantage. Use the motion to recess to your motion. Move to adjourn. If you make a motion to adjourn, it takes precedence over almost everything else, and it has to be voted on. And if the motion's adjourned, you've put off the vote on that. If you're successful in your motion to adjourn, you've put off the vote on that motion until the next meeting. And if it's near the end of the meeting and people are tired and so on and so forth, you might succeed. It's certainly worth a try. I don't actually advocate breaking the quorum, but if you're pretty sure there isn't a quorum, bring that to the attention of the chair if you're opposed to a motion. If there's no quorum, they cannot proceed with any further business. I've seen conventions and meetings where people actually literally use that as a tactic where they walk out of the room to try and break the quorum. I don't really advocate that, but there's certainly nothing wrong with you saying to the chair, getting up and saying, Mr. Chairman, point of order or point of information, I believe there isn't a quorum. And then he has to he has to determine whether there's a quorum or not. If the motion passes, again, if you vote on the prevailing side, you can move to reconsider. After a meeting, you can move to repeal or rescind it at the next meeting. You have to wait a meeting or two to do that. But you can make a motion to rescind it, or you can make a motion to amend something previously adopted. Both of those things can be done. You have to take into consideration how people feel about that. I mean, I'm not a big fan of bringing the same question up over and over and over and over and over again, but you have to make that judgment for yourself, whether it's worthwhile to do that. Okay, but that's something you can do if you feel it's absolutely necessary. Now, what do you do if you lose? I mean, completely lost. You can't. You've done everything you can. You made the motion to reconsider. The motion to rescind will obviously fail even if you try it. What are your obligations as a member? Well, I hate to tell you this, but members of an assembly under Robert's Rules of Order are not allowed to speak against actions of the assembly. Your obligation as a member, now I know this doesn't happen in reality, but I'm talking about formally under Robert's Rules of Order. Your obligations as a member is either to keep silent or to support the actions of the assembly, or if it's really, really egregiously bad and it completely offends your sense of ethics or morals, to resign. That does not mean that you cannot at some future point in time bring up the question again. You can always do that. But keep in mind that if you undermine others, you're creating a situation where others feel okay to undermine you when you do win. You can see it happening in Congress right now. There's all kinds of things that are happening in the United States Congress that are partially the result of, well, you gored my ox, so I'm going to gore your ox. So have a nice day. So on. Now, handout numbers 18. If you've downloaded the handouts, it says frequent things you want to do. Now I'm going to go through that and talk a little bit about the motions in question. There's also a thing on the motions themselves, a handout that has the motions themselves. It's handout number 10. Just a quick thing on that chart. You'll see some paragraph markings. Those paragraph markings are section markings where it says like section 30. That's the section in Robert's Rules of Order that has that rule. So if you have the most recent copy of Robert's Rules of Order and you want to know about a point of order, it's section 23. If you want to know about an appeal, it's section 24, and so on and so forth. That gives you some guidance of where to look. I mean, some of these chapters the sections are fairly long, but at least it gives you some idea of where to go and look. Okay, now present an idea for consideration or action. Well, the most obvious way to do that is to make a motion. Under Robert's Rules of Order, in a formal situation, you can't debate anything unless a motion is made or a resolution is made. So you want to consider something, you make a motion on that matter. There's one other thing you can do. It's called consider informally. It's a motion that you basically pass to kind of like suspend the rules a little bit so you can discuss things without making a motion. And there are different kinds of that, and I won't go into that too much, but there is a motion to consider informally. The other thing you can do that's kind of more long-term is include in your agenda, as part of the formal agenda, a subject heading, which this isn't on this, but I thought I'd mention this anyways, a subject heading usually near the end called something like general good and welfare, or for the good of the assembly, or something like that. And what that can be used for is it can be an opportunity for members to speak on some subject of importance to them without the making of a motion. It's also a place for announcements, but announcements by itself doesn't do it. Saying announcements by itself doesn't do it. Improve a pending question. Amend. If you kind of like the motion, but you don't like the amount of money being spent, if it's a financial motion, or you want the committee that's being created to be 10 members instead of 8 members, I mean, obviously you make an amendment. The other thing you can do is a division of the question. If you've got a multi-part motion, okay, you can move to split that up and then you can discuss and debate each section separately before you finally get to voting it. And what that does, of course, is if you divide the question, the limits on debate apply to each section. So let's say you have a 5-part motion. If you split the question into 5 parts, you can debate each thing under the rules of debate, each part, amend each part, without exhausting your rights of debate on other parts. So that's another way to do it. Regulator cutoff debate. Under Robert's Rules of Order, if you don't make any change in the rules, nobody can speak more than twice to any one debatable motion. Nobody can speak more than 10 minutes. You always have the right to modify that. A motion to limit or extend debate, a motion to change the number of times you debate, a motion to limit the time that people have to debate. All of those things can be done by the making of a motion. And obviously, I've already gone over the motion for the previous question, but if you feel that I don't know how many times I've been in an organization where it's very clear after about 10 minutes how they're going to vote 30 minutes later. So you make a motion for the previous question, especially, of course, if the vote is something that will go in your favor, which I've already mentioned. How to delay an action? Well, refer to committee. Mr. Chairman, I move that we refer it to an already existing standing committee, or Mr. Chairman, I move we refer it to a committee of 3 people to be appointed by the chair to report back to us at the next meeting. Whatever is allowable under your governing documents in terms of that sort of thing, you can refer to committee. And of course, I mentioned earlier, you can motion to postpone. You can motion to postpone indefinitely, which of course kills the motion, but you can also motion to postpone to a time certain. So, Mr. Chairman, I move that we postpone this till next week, which, by the way, is debatable as to the merits of doing that. And there's even something where you can say, Mr. Chairman, I move we postpone it till next week and make it a special order, which means it comes up in a special place in the agenda before unfinished business or new business. So it comes up a little earlier on the agenda. If you want, but basically the most common form is just, Mr. Minister, postpone till next week. I should note that sometimes people say table to next week. That is not a tabling motion, despite the use of the word table. Tabling is a motion that's non-debatable and has a very specific purpose, which I went into last week. And I'll answer that question I just saw in a second, after I'm done what I'm discussing right now. Yeah. Okay. So someone here has a question. Explain denying a quorum. I call it breaking a quorum. Breaking a quorum is when let's say you have a meeting that has a quorum of 25 people. Just to pick a random number. There's 26 people in the room, and you and 3 friends, leaving one behind so that they can question a quorum, deliberately get up and leave the meeting to break the quorum. If there is no quorum, unless there's a law stating otherwise, there's some corporate laws do state something different, but let's assume there isn't. If you break a quorum, no business can be done except adjourn, recess, actions that would allow you to create a quorum. That last one isn't done very often, but occasionally you may have read of legislatures going out and arresting members to bring them into the assembly, into the House of Representatives or whatever. So that's I call that breaking a quorum. I don't like it because I think it's kind of a tactic. But nevertheless, it's something that's available to you. don't make the mistake of not leaving. If you're going to do it, don't make the mistake of not leaving somebody behind to suggest the absence of a quorum to the chair. Okay? Otherwise, you'll all leave and they'll proceed with business saying, well, we thought we had a quorum. The chair is supposed to keep an eye on and make sure whether there's a quorum or not. But you know, if it's close, they could continue on and legitimately say, well, we didn't know. You can't suggest the absence of a quorum after business has been done. You've got to do it before they get to the business in question. Okay, suppress a proposal. Okay, well, okay, if someone is making a motion and you're absolutely sure that this body may not be taking up that question, it's not within the authority of the assembly to discuss, debate, or make a decision on this. There's something called object to the consideration of a question. And that's basically what you're saying when you make that motion. It is not debatable, and it takes a 2/3 vote to pass. But you can kind of get a little bit of debate in by saying, Mr. Chairman, I object to the consideration of the question because blah, blah, blah. I should also note that even when rights of debate have been closed off, you can raise points of order, parliamentary inquiries, points of information, phrase them as a question. You can usually, very often you can get points across that way. I already mentioned postponing indefinitely. You can try to get the maker of the motion to request that he be allowed to withdraw the motion. That still takes a vote of the assembly, but if you've convinced the maker of a motion that it's not a good idea and they ask for it to be withdrawn, there's a reasonably good chance that the assembly will probably let him do that if it's done early on. Let me see. Meet an emergency. Question of privilege. Mr. Chairman, I can't hear. Mr. Chairman, someone in the back just had a heart attack. We need to call a doctor. Suspend the rules. Almost every rule, with some few exceptions, can be suspended usually by a 2/3 vote of the assembly for a specific purpose. You can't we can't make a motion like, Mr. Chairman, I move we suspend Robert's Rules of Order for the rest of the meeting. You can't do that. But you can make a motion, Mr. Chairman, I move we suspend the rules on the limitation of debate for the duration of this debate. There are certain ones you can't suspend. You can't suspend, for example, the right of the right of a member to have notice of the meeting. Usually, unless you've written something in your governing document says otherwise, all members are supposed to receive notices of meeting. Okay, and now that does not mean that if someone changed their address or if you're doing it by email, their email address, and didn't inform the secretary or whoever is in charge of that their rights have been violated. So long as the secretary, I'm assuming it's the secretary makes notice of the meeting, so long as the secretary sends out a notice of the meeting in a timely fashion, and that may vary depending on what your rules say, could be 7 days, could be 14 days. They're not responsible for the other person not giving them the correct information to deliver the postcard or send the email. That part's on the part of the member. But every member has a right to be informed of a meeting. And you can't suspend that right. That's an unsuspendable right. Just to give you an example of something that is unsuspendable. Gain information on a pending motion. Parliamentary inquiry, that's a question about parliamentary procedure. Request for information or Point of information, that's a question about a matter of fact. Mr. Chairman, how much money do we have in the bank? If we're going to make this purchase, how much money do we have in the bank? That's my favorite one for some reason. A question of privilege. That can be used that way under certain specific circumstances where you're trying to gain some information. Mr. Chairman, is it? I'm trying to think of one that would be an example, but safety, health, integrity, whatever. And of course, a request to ask a member a question. When a member is speaking, you usually don't have the right to interrupt them, but you can get up and you can ask, Mr. Chairman, may I please ask a question of the speaker? And if he gives you permission, you can then ask him your question. Generally, you don't interrupt speakers when they're speaking, except with certain types of motions that are not usually non-debatable. Parliamentary inquiry, point of information, point of order. All those can be made without necessarily waiting to be recognized by the chair. And usually they can interrupt the speaker. If you look at the handout that says rules related to motion, there's a part of that that says, can you interrupt the speaker or not? Question the decision of the chair. I went over that a little bit, but basically that's a point of order followed by an appeal from the decision of the chair if you disagree with the decision the chair has made. So a point of order is pointing out or asking the chair or pointing out to the chair that there's a particular rule that should be followed. If the chair agrees with you, no problem. If the chair disagrees, your point of order is not well taken. And then you go to an appeal from the decision of the chair, and there's a whole process to deal with that, which ends on a vote of whether or not to uphold the chair or not. The rules of debate are a little different. The chair gets to speak first. Everybody else gets to speak once. The chair gets to close. They're the only one that gets to speak twice. And then you take a vote on whether to uphold the chair or not. And you can overturn the chair. If you overturn the chair, then they're supposed to then proceed on the basis of the assembly's interpretation of the rule and not their interpretation of the rule. Enforce rights and privileges. Enforce rights and privileges. I think I mentioned division of the assembly last time. Most votes, unless it's specified otherwise, are voice votes. All those, at least if it's a majority vote, all those in favor say aye, all those opposed say nay. If the chair announces a result, and you need to do this immediately, by the way, and you disagree with the chair's opinion, then you can ask for division of the assembly, and he or she has to do it. A division of the assembly is a physical vote. Robert's Rules of Order is a standing, but it could be a hand vote. Raise your hand. All those in favor, raise your hand. All those opposed, raise your hand. The point is it's a visual indication of the vote, which they should do, by the way, if the vote is a 2/3 vote or a 3/4 vote or anything other than a majority vote. The chair should, if they're taking the vote as opposed to asking for unanimous consent, if hearing no objection, do a visual, something that's visual so they can see, because it's relatively easy to hear a majority. It's not easy to hear a 2/3. You might be 60%. Was it 60%? Was it 55%? Was it no. They should take, if it's a 2/3 vote, they should, and it's not unanimous consent. They should be taking a visual vote, either a standing vote or a hand vote. Division of the question, I already went into that. Parliamentary inquiry, point of order, appeal from the decision chair. I've already done. These are all things that can be done to enforce your rights and privileges. Okay, if you feel they're being violated or not enforced. Consider a question again. There's actually a type of motion called to bring a motion again before the assembly. There's like 4 of them. Okay. Resume consideration on something where debate has been cut off, or to take it from the table if it's been put on the table. reconsider, which I already called, and rescind, or to rescind something or to amend something previously adopted. A lot of people don't know this, but once you pass a motion, if it's something of permanent and standing effect, in other words, it's arguably something as a policy or a procedure or something like that will be done, that can be done over and over and over and over again, that motion stays in effect until you specifically, under Robert's Rules of Order, until you specifically vote to change it, to repeal it, to rescind it, to amend it. Now, if you're doing that, if you're amending something, and by the way, what I'm talking about includes if you're repealing something. If you're amending something that's been previously adopted, the rules for voting are a little different. If you want to do it at that meeting, it either takes a 2/3 vote or a majority of the entire membership, whichever vote is easier to get, to do that. Okay, and usually, by the way, in most organizations, it's a 2/3 vote because that's the easier vote to get. If you give prior notice, in other words, if you put it on the agenda as part of the notice of the meeting, and the meeting was noticed in a timely fashion, it only takes a majority vote. So either it takes a supermajority with no warning, or a regular majority with some warning to the members so they understand that it's coming up. There is something under Robert's Rules of Order referred to as an implied amendment. Let's say you don't do that, and you pass another motion on the same subject. The newer motion, where it disagrees, the newer thing you've passed, where it disagrees with the older thing you passed, takes precedence over the older thing. But those things that are in the older resolution or motion that aren't contradicted by the newer one are still in effect. You want to try to avoid that kind of confusion, assuming you've got people who are paying attention. Change in action already taken. Reconsider, rescind, amend a motion previously adopted. I've gone into all of that. All of that is possible. Terminate a meeting. Well, a motion to adjourn, a motion to recess. I'm going to talk about a special form of it. It's called a motion to adjourn. I call it adjourn to a time certain, and I think I'm using an older form of it. There's one motion that takes precedence in terms of dealing with it over a regular motion to adjourn. And that's a motion to adjourn to a time certain. And what that really is think of it as a long recess. You're saying we're going to stop the meeting now, and we're going to start it up again 2 days later, 3 days later, tomorrow. You just can't delay it beyond the next regular meeting. So say you have monthly meetings, you've gotten about halfway to 2/3 through your agenda. It's 1 o'clock in the morning. There's nothing on the agenda that is particularly needs to be dealt with immediately. A person can make a motion to adjourn the meeting until tomorrow at 7 o'clock, or to 2 days from now at 7 o'clock, or a week from now at 7 o'clock, or 6 o'clock, or whatever time you want to pick. When you meet again, that meeting is simply a continuation of the original meeting. Okay, so it's like think of it as a long recess. And it actually takes precedence over a regular motion to adjourn. That's the only thing that does. Like I said, this is handout 18 that has these things, and you probably should read it in conjunction with handout 10. At this point, are there any questions that either ones I didn't see and haven't answered, or any new ones? No? Okay. If there's, one of the handouts, at least I hope she included it as one of the handouts, is actually something that the University of Wisconsin, I believe it's the University of Wisconsin, does an online Robert's Rules of Order class. It's a full semester long course. It's done online. University of Wisconsin. It costs you money. So, it's not something you want to do unless you've got the money to spend and you're willing to put the time and effort into it. Last time I checked, for those of you who want to become members of the National Association of Parliamentarians, the organization I'm a member of, the National Association of Parliamentarians requires you to take a test to become a member. But if you've taken this course and passed it, they will defer the test and allow you to, as long as you provide and prove, allow you to become a member. Not quite an hour. Is there anybody? Again, are there any questions that you want to ask? Of course, my contact information is on these handouts, most of them at least anyways, and people are welcome to email me or call me with a specific question or questions if they want. I know it's a little early, but unless someone has a specific question they want to ask, I think I've covered everything I want to cover tonight. Okay. No, you cannot suspend a rule permanently. I know somebody said, if there's a rule you don't like, that's part of Robert's Rules of Order, then what you do is you pass, just as an example, is you pass what's called a special rule of order. And special rules of order are essentially those things, you saying, I want to do it this way and not the way it says in the book. An example might be is that, and I've seen this done, that the motion, remember I told you about the motion table in last week. The motion to table is the most misused motion under Robert's Rules of Order. I've seen organizations pass a special rule saying that motions to table shall not be entertained, are out of order. If you want to, so if there's something you want to do differently, regardless of what that is, you simply pass what's called a special rule of order. Rules of order, real briefly, rules of order are divided into two categories. Special rules of orders are rules that deal with parliamentary procedure where you want to do things differently than in your handbook, in this case, Roberts. And standing rules are rules that deal with things that are administrative in nature. The most common one used to be no smoking. Now it's turn off your cell phone. People, members will turn off their cell phones or put them on silent during the meeting, just to give an example. Any other questions? Okay, then I guess I'm done. I've done in 2 hours something that I normally try to do in about 6, and on top of that, the Robert's Rules of Order is several thousand pages, I think over 1,000 pages long. But so there's a lot of stuff and a lot of detail I didn't cover. So people are welcome to call me. For those who don't want to become parliamentarians in the sense that I'm a parliamentarian, I highly recommend Robert's Rules of Order, newly revised in brief, 2nd edition. Because that is like a much shorter version, but everything in it is compatible with Robert's Rules of Order. So if you read that, everything in it is accurate and doesn't contradict the larger book. Thank you, and I appreciate the time.